Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Lina de Barros, Leah O'Toole and Simon Klippert will talk about relationships.
Why are relationships in education important?
Relationships are the basis for working in an educational environment. If I don't have relationships, how can I work together with other human beings, especially with kids and teenagers? So it's basically to create a link between me and another person with whom I'm staying in maybe even 8 hours a day or for many, many years together in a working relationship. So this is why, for sure, we need relationships. And often this social aspect of relationship is seen as an add-on, for example, at school, while the opposite is true. I need a relationship for an atmosphere of well-being to afterwards have an atmosphere that creates successful learning. So I really need it. Third and last point about that is that for sure all students need relationships. But if we look at students who are in insecure living situations and who have only lose their relationships in their daily life, for them it's especially important if we want them to have a successful learning experience at school. We need grounding relationships with professional educators.
Yeah, I agree, because we're increasingly becoming aware of humans as social creatures. So, for example, there's a lot of research on the social brain and how children's brains develop in the context of relationships. So, to give you an example, there's maybe the work of Patricia Kuhl, who looked at the development of language, and she found that babies and toddlers who were presented with language on screens didn't develop language in the same way as those who were engaging in interactions with human beings. Our brains are made to develop through social interactions. So I think we're becoming increasingly aware in education of this fact that learning and development happens in the context of relationships. We know that, for example, the teacher's role is to kind of create a psychological safety. It's very, very hard to learn deeply in an environment in which, for example, the child is afraid or the child is disengaged. You know, there needs to be that balance where there's what we call freedom to learn. There's also the idea that a child's self-image very much stems from the image that the teacher has of them. So, for example, if the adult puts forward to the child that they're clever, that they're capable, that they're interesting, that they're important, all of those things become internalized into the child's self-image. And of course, that's then going to impact on learning based on their self-efficacy beliefs. But I think the strongest argument for looking at relationships in education is really that, you know, these relationships are impacting on learning anyway, whether we choose to acknowledge them or not. So I think it's kind of prudent really to really think about these relationships and try to ensure that the teacher-student relationship has the most positive results that it can.
What is a relationship?
So a relationship is hard to define because relationships are nothing static. A relationship is a dynamic process and a relationship depends on a lot of variables, such as time, as reciprocity. But for analytical purposes, we might distinguish between symmetrical and asymmetrical relationships. And this distinction has been made before by communications theory, but with regard to communication, symmetric and asymmetrical communication. So when we think about relationships in terms of symmetry and asymmetry, we might say that a symmetric relationship is characterized by the fact that both parties have a similar power over the continuity or the discontinuity of the relationship. While, as opposed to that, in an asymmetrical relationship, the power to continue or discontinue the relationship is more with one person than with the other. Or in other words, one person is for structural reasons or economic reasons, one person depends more on the continuity than the other.
Yeah, I think that relationships can kind of be thought of almost like a dance. So a relationship is a dynamic, two-way, reciprocal interaction between two very active human beings, and very often I am with you as you are with me. So I think the notion of a dance is a useful one, because we realise that the steps I take impact on how maybe you move in return. So these relationships then will get established over time with regards to an accumulation of different interactions that allow, for example, the child to predict how a teacher might react in a setting. And of course, our relationships are also impacted by our previous experiences. So, for example, there's a phrase that we bring more to school than our backpacks. We bring with us all of the previous relationships we've experienced, and in particular, the early relationships we've experienced, where we learn how to be and what to expect from the world and who we are as people. So those kind of previous experiences will impact on what I expect from the relationship I'm experiencing now and how I respond as a result. These things are also impacted obviously by an organisational culture. So, for example, if I'm a teacher that feels a little bit insecure in my role within the organisation, maybe then it's harder for me to be open with the children and experience them as they are, rather than how I wish I could make them be. And of course, these things are also influenced by the broader society and by our cultural backgrounds and cultural norms. And all of this complex dynamic stuff is happening in the moment as two people interact with each other.
So maybe I might add that the metaphor of a dance is a very beautiful one, and it can also lead to a like action-reaction pattern. And in addition to this, we have discussed a lot about also how our sense of self, but you will go into that in more detail later, and our expectations of what the other person thinks about us actually influence this dance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what is special about a relationship in a pedagogical context?
So the student-teacher or educator relationship is characterized by the roles that are, and the images of these roles, the norms that come along with the expectation that is attached to these roles. So while norms and roles and beliefs change over time, there is some, and also they change over cultural contexts, there is something that seems to be consistent over several different cultural contexts. That is that the role of the teacher is usually an adult who is paid for what they are doing. And this is a commonality that we have to address when thinking about the role of teacher and of student. And thinking of the two teacher-student relationship under the lens of paid labor helps the public to address expectations and to have expectations, legitimately have expectations towards the teacher and the professionality of the teacher. It also helps the teacher to distance themselves from to separate the spheres and to distance themselves somewhat from the expectations and limit them to the sphere of work. So to define a pedagogical relationship, one lens is surely not enough, but in a society where resources and also recognition are distributed mainly through monetarily, we have to address the role of capitalism and how it structures our relationships. Relationships, since they are structured by social norms and narratives and role expectations, we can not think of a relationship that is not influenced by this. And that means that we also have to look at power structures, not only capitalism, and how these power structures influence and filter into our classrooms.
What does a good pedagogical relationship look like, and can we even define it?
I think it's very difficult to define a really good pedagogical relationship, because these things are so culturally and individually specific. But as we've started to research relationships in education, a few things have emerged, kind of common themes across settings that aim to centre relationships in their practice. And one of them really is the idea that the teacher provides a kind of a secure base, in the terminology of attachment theory, a secure base from which to explore the child's learning, or a kind of a grounding relationship, so that the child and the children in the class feel that, you know, if they make a mistake, they can pick themselves up and be resilient, that if something is hard, it's okay not to get it straight away, that if they make a mistake or if they want to kind of try something new, it's not the end of the world if it doesn't go completely right, because they'll still be held in the high regard of the teacher. And that empowers them then really to be creative and to try new things and to keep going when it isn't easy. I think one of the important things to point out about educational relationships is that they're not always easy. So it's not about everybody being happy all the time and meeting every child's needs all the time and everything, you know, always being right, because there are obviously going to be positions or situations where the teacher kind of has to provoke the child out of their comfort zone in order to take the next step in learning. And for some children that's really hard. They might react badly. But I think it's important for the teacher to understand that a negative reaction doesn't mean a bad relationship. You know, it's that holding relationship to allow those experiences to be processed that's important. And of course, there are things that are needs, for example, that are beyond the control or remit of the teacher. So there's a real risk that teachers who are very relationally focused can feel as though they have to be all things to all people. They have to save the world. And of course, that's not realistic. So in our conversations, we've come to the conclusion really that what we're aiming for is to be realistically caring, realistically trusting, realistically engaged with the children, so that they feel cared for and heard and trusted. But that it's the idea, similar to Winnicott's ideas for parents about being good enough. We think the teachers maybe can aim to be good enough. They don't have to be perfect, because guess what? Teachers are human too. So I think that's the real emphasis that we've put on self-care and ensuring that teachers take care of their needs as well as those of the children.
What influences the distribution of resources and thereby the distribution of power in the classroom?
So, like in our discussions, we came up with a pretty short and a little bit reductionist definition of power, but it serves our purpose. So we understand power as the influence that you have over yourself and over your environment. Environment meaning people, inanimate objects, like everything around you. So since earlier we talked about relationships being structured by society's narratives, such as capitalism, but also colonialism, ableism, social Darwinism. All these narratives have their part in the structuring of our relationships. And since they are not neutral, the narratives, they position some identities at the bottom and some others at the top. We need to reflect on them. And we need to be mindful in how we deal with power. So putting the well-being of the teacher or giving a central place to the well-being of the teacher also includes like the reflection of the well-being of everybody and some aspects of power sharing.
So talking about resources, teacher habitus comes to my mind because for sure me as a teacher, I was born and raised in a special way, and also my students were born and raised in a special way, but for most of the time it differs. It's not exactly the same. So I have to be aware of these differences that go along with power and go along with resources. And if I don't have it in mind, I don't fit the needs of my students.
Yeah, I might reproduce dehumanizing ideologies without like wanting to.
Yeah, if I'm not, I just go inside and I just reproduce inequality, and that could be not my aim. So to fit my students' needs, there is a reflection, self-reflection of these power structures necessary before. If not, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, so recognizing these power structures might actually help us to deepen the relationships.
Yes.
So, and we need to acknowledge that that our relationships do not only depend on goodwill and good intentions. They are structured by power, so if we don't reflect it, we might unintentionally reproduce it. But we can, or do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think there's one big mistake many teachers do, and also I do sometimes, is that you have this self-image as a teacher, because that goes along with the habitus and with the position in society, because you're a teacher and teachers are meant to know everything. And so for me, the exact opposite is helpful as a teacher. So to go into the classroom, to be humble and be honest to yourself, to say, okay, there's many things that these kids, these teenagers know, do, that they live, that they have gone through, that I don't know. And if I'm aware of that, then we can start talking.
I think this is really important in relation to inclusion particularly, because if teachers don't have the capacity for a really critical self-reflection like that, then it's very easy when things go wrong within the relationship for it to be, in the mind of the teacher, the fault of the child. So everything is the fault of the child because I can't look to see what role I've played in this. And if you have children in the class who, for whatever reason, find it difficult to fit the mould of the traditional classroom, then, you know, without that critical self-reflection, we can have a really big problem.
So for every teacher who's standing in class and asking, so why don't you do what I'm saying? Yeah. Just ask yourself, why? There are reasons.
Yeah, what's my role in the dance?
Yeah, what's my role in that dance?
And like, your role is not your fault, but you have the resources and the capacity to think about your role and to think about the relationship also in terms of symmetry and asymmetry. Might there be an asymmetry in the relationship that you're not aware of, that is inspired by the big narratives of colonialism, of the binary gender divide, of patriarchy? And only then can you influence the power that these narratives hold over your life and your relationship. So you are not going to do this only for the sake of students. That's what taxpayers and families might expect from you, but you're also going to do this for yourself because you don't want these narratives to hold this power over you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, then somehow, so to say so, you reproduce an oppressive system.
Yes.
What should we do with this power?
So with the power and the power you have in the classroom because of the asymmetric relationship between student and teacher, that is power on the one hand, but there's another power that comes with the privileges you have without your contribution. And with both of these powers you yield, there is a responsibility that comes along with it. We have some ideas of how to use your power for good, and everybody can feel free to add, to comment, to change. Take what is useful, and what doesn't help you, don't take it. You might want to have a look at the teacher habitus chapter as well. So one of the ideas was mentioned earlier by you as well, is listen. Listen and then be an amplifier of voices that are overheard easily. Also be a filter So be a filter in that sense means help discriminatory language become a background noise rather than the dominating tone in the classroom. Distinguish between prevention and intervention. Not in every moment you can have both. So a good intervention also has a preventive function, but an intervention usually aims at protecting those who are affected by negative behavior, while the prevention aims at those who are showing the destructive behavior. So in a situation of crisis, distinguish between the two, protect first, and then direct your attention to the education process. And it might need some time. It will take some time. Let everybody cool off and then go back into the situation. If you think about conflicts yourself in the heat of an argument, you might not be able to critically reflect on what you've done. Don't use discriminatory language yourself, and when called out for it, think about it. Don't react immediately, let it sink in. Think about it, ask for help from activist groups, and then react on it. Don't never ever use the discontinuity of a relationship as a threat, because that threatens the basis for everything. Condone the act, not the person, and use restorative practice as a form to restore relationships, and thereby to rebuild trust. Restorative practice can be seen also as a way of reparations. They, rather than forgiveness, they aim at restoring the self-respect of both parties. Apologize if you have harmed somebody, and use power to empower.
What are the challenges and barriers to putting relationships at the center of educational practice?
I would like to identify two main challenges. One is that working on relationship and seeing it as something central in pedagogical context, especially at school, is something that is very rarely to be found in initial teacher education. So for sure you have some specializations that focus it, but personally I never learned about it, and then I arrived at school and I had to do my second degree maybe once again while I was already at school. So I think this is one challenge that it should, that initial teacher education should provide these skills, maybe in a general way, because as we said, relationships are always individual, but there are some things that we also partly identified as useful if you work in that context. So that would be the first challenge. And the second one is time. Because as somebody who works on a daily basis as a teacher, there are so many things teachers are asked to do, and even if relationship, or as we say in German, like Beziehungsarbeit, is something that I consider crucial as part of my job, it's something that demands a lot of time. So for example, if I go to visit a student and the student's family at home, it's something that I personally like a lot, and that gives me insights and that gives me starting points not only on a personal level but also maybe to have more fitting learner settings afterwards in class. It takes time. It takes 1 hour, it takes 2 hours, and I'm not paid for this because it's not part of the job description. Same if I have a long and maybe intense talk. During the pandemic, it was something very useful. Students that you don't see anymore in person, you could meet them and have maybe a long walk and a long talk about the well-being, about the challenges, about also things that you need to learn, like whatever, a book to read or whatever. But all this is not seen as something as like It's something part of the job description, and I do it in my free time after all. So this is my main challenge if I talk about relationship in a pedagogical context. We need time, and we need also to consider it as part of the job.
And this aspect of time also relates to the structure of the school, because if you see students for 1 hour a week for teaching biology, you don't have the time to build a relationship.
No, you can't. It's just not possible. Yeah. Talking very shortly from a personal perspective, I have been teaching music for 1 hour in one class, and it was horrible for everyone because there was no relationship. And then on the other hand, I've been working for 5 years with the same class, with the families, with the brothers and sisters, with the challenges, with all the development of 5 years, and also my personal development of 5 years, and that has been not always, but mostly quite wonderful.
I think this really brings to the fore the importance that policymakers really need to understand the importance of relationships, because increasingly we see this kind of neoliberal logic that the only things that matter are literacy and numeracy scores, you know, and so teachers get this increasing message that that's where they need to spend their time. So if our policymakers and those who develop educational structures could understand the really, really central role that relationships play in learning, then I think maybe they could work towards allocation of more time for teachers and allow them that message to understand that actually the work of the relationship is really central to the role. And I also think one of the aims we would have, I think, for this chapter would be to support teachers and educators to have the language to defend the approaches they use in terms of focusing on relationships. So for example, when inspectors come, to be able to explain why they have spent their time working on the relationship.
And also, as you say, so I can be a good teacher for some of my students. Not only because my resources are limited, but also because there are some students who relate more to other teachers. So, I mean, that's not the goal of like relationship, to have a very deep and whatever relationship to each and every student, no. But to see it as the duty of the teacher and part of their job to create that relationship, to have a working ground. That is the point.
Yeah, and let me come back just quickly to the well-being and self-care and why we do things. It draws on things both of you said earlier. So the well-being of the teacher is never the kid's job. It's the teacher's job to make sure that they care for themselves and that they have a social network. And we might use this as a tool for self-reflection and to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? And if the answer is because I see this as part of my job or as an ethical, my ethical attitude requires that I here go a step further and I make a home visit or I fight for a student's visa, then that is a good answer, a good enough answer. But when I can't answer that in these terms and I expect the student to be grateful, or I expect love and care in return, or appreciation or a fan club, then I should reconsider my actions. Because otherwise I will endanger also the mental stability of the kids. Because I will only be able to give this if I get something in return or until my resources run out. And if I then disappear out of the life of the kid for burnout or because other people in my life need me or because I move, then that's a crushing experience, especially for kids with ambivalent attachment styles or fearful attachment styles.
Does a focus on relationships mean letting children get away with murder?
Yes. No, just kidding. It's,
No, absolutely not.
Maybe you write a letter from prison, to prison.
Yeah, it's a common misconception, I think, when it comes to a discussion about relationships in education. People sometimes feel that if you're focused on relationships, then you just have no discipline, there are no boundaries, children can do whatever they want. So we felt it was very important to really counteract that idea, because going back to our discussion about what a relationship is, we talked in that about how a relationship is a two-way, reciprocal, dynamic interaction between two people. So if either of those people's needs and wishes and concerns dominate the relationship, then that's not going to be a positive outcome. So, you know, traditionally in really authoritarian classes, only the needs of the teacher and the school were foregrounded, and those of the children didn't matter at all. And we're increasingly discovering the damage that that did, you know, particularly again in terms of inclusion for people who may have struggled to fit the mould of the school or the classroom. So if we were then to swing towards a situation where the teacher's needs are totally disregarded and only the concerns of the child or the wishes of the child were put to the centre of the educational relationship, then that wouldn't be useful either. And there's lots of research showing that children don't learn well when there are no boundaries, when there are no clear rules, or when they're not sure how they're supposed to behave. These things are really important. It's a huge role of the teacher to kind of contain the feelings of the children and to draw boundaries and to create a safe space for everybody. So that's a really important element.
You might, out of fear of authoritarianism, you might reject power altogether. And we just want to empower you to make use of power, because the absence of your power doesn't mean the absence of power. Other forces will take over, and that is very likely to be within the frames of our society, the destructive and discriminatory narratives.
So an important role of the teacher is to establish that relational environment. And, you know, if for example, a child does something to disturb the learning possibilities for themselves or for other children, of course, the adult in the room has to identify that and maybe have a conversation with the child about that. But the key issue really for us, I think, is to distinguish between punishment and consequences. So consequences are focused on a kind of restorative practice approach where the child can make reparations for the damage that have been done, and the aim of a consequence then is to preserve the relationship. And the difference then between a punishment, that's more about the teacher establishing control and dominance. So certainly in answer to your question, it doesn't mean that we don't apply any boundaries. In fact, the opposite. It's really important that the teacher does that.
What are the benefits of putting relationship at the center of educational practice?
First of all, I have to say it's fun. So it makes your working day a lot easier for each and everyone, for yourself and for hopefully many students. Also, secondly, I think if kids come into situations of crisis, so where something is happening, and you have a grounded relationship with the students you're working with, it is very helpful for them to lift them up again afterwards and to have a basis, a talking basis, a trust basis also. I think then another point is that if you have a deeper understanding of how students are, what they're interested in and what they need, it's not only useful for you to understand them as a human being, but also could be useful for your class, for the lessons you teach in a traditional way, because you have always topics that you can choose. You have always approaches that you can highlight. You have always things that you can discuss in class. And if you know more about your students, for sure you can make your your lesson, actually, your class is more meaningful to them. And that helps to create a better learning also. So, I mean, these are some benefits. And then last but not least, I think if you chose to work as a teacher, as an educator, I think, or I guess you might be interested in how human beings are and what they're interested in and how they develop and how you can work with them also for a longer time and see how they are developing. So, I mean, this is something a very interesting part of our job. And so if you rely on relationship, maybe there's nothing better than to getting to know young people that you work with.
Yeah, I might add that having this sense of critical self-reflection might seem frightening to some, but you're not opening up everything for discussion. You do this from a certain set of values that are the belief in diversity as a worth in itself, valuing pluralism, valuing democracy, valuing symmetric relationships. And these can then act as your compass. So you can be more flexible with all the other stuff. You can question yourself and your beliefs. When in turn you still have something like a compass that grounds you, and that can then lead to where do you actually put the boundaries? Where do you and when do you set them, and when do you take a step back? And all of this in the face of yourself working as an amplifier of voices, so you let yourself be influenced by other voices that are easily overheard.
So, how do I decide to which students I build a deeper relationship and to which students I maybe build a relationship that is good enough?
So I think there are two answers to the question. The first and the obvious is let the students choose. So they will show you that they need your attention. And they can show this positively, they can also show this negatively. And then you choose how you respond. That is one part of the answer. And the other answer is, in an unequal society, you should always have a look at the distribution of resources. So if a kid that demands your attention, very much so, comes from a background that is economically very stable, it still might be emotionally very needy, but you're not the only person who can help them. And if you have to make decisions on how you spend your resources, the class is a very important context, because we tend to reproduce class structures, and those families who speak our language in terms of class very often get more attention. Maybe because the parents are lawyers or doctors, so they talk with us diagnostics and law, and then we are very likely to follow their demands, but that's not necessarily what the kid needs. It might also be, but it might also not be. What I think is very, very important, that because we are especially working at public schools, is that we use our resources particularly for those who are deprived of other resources.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to remember that a classroom is a relational system. It's not just, one relationship with one child or with another child. So you might feel that you're giving your resources to one child and engaging with them, but you can't forget that all of the other children in the class are observing, they're learning from that interaction. So let's say, for example, if a child, you ask a question in the classroom and a child puts up their hand and they give an answer and the teacher says, oh, what a terrible answer, I can't believe you said that. Every other child in the class, next time the answer or the question comes, they're going to think, well, I'm not putting up my hand. I'm certainly not going to make myself vulnerable to that kind of a response. And equally, as you model really positive relationships with one child, that filters out into the whole classroom system. So in some ways, while you do kind of target your resources towards those you feel need it the most, that can still be of benefit to everybody in the class.
And drawing on what you said, like the relational system and the messages you send to the other kids. Yesterday we had a discussion with Rose how we educate boys to entitlement. So when you count the amount of time that you spend talking to boys in the classroom, very often it is more. I'm sorry for the gender binary. In that sense, it's actually helpful to see that because there is still patriarchy. If we spend more time with boys, whether their behavior is destructive or productive, it doesn't matter. If we spend more time, that time is a resource. In capitalism, time is as good as money. So we show them that they have the right to do this. And this sense of entitlement, then they carry on in their biographies.
I just want to add a point on relationship and relational system within the school. There's not only one teacher, one student, not only one teacher with a class of students, but there's also other relationships inside the school. So relationship to the janitor, to the secretary, to the other colleagues that we're working with. And this also for sure has an effect on what a relationship can look like if we treat people in a respectful way.
I wanted to add something with regard to the sense of entitlement, because we also teach the girls that they don't have the right to take up space. And that is, I want to share a story about this. Something that happened in my classroom was that I'm teaching a self-defense class in my school, and it's for girls, trans and inter kids, and many of the girls know that when they come to me, because we have like story sharing times also, when they come to me, I listen to them and I take their concerns serious. At our school, because it's a relational school, everybody takes concerns serious, but because I'm trained as a self-defense, feminist self-defense trainer, I hear the problems with a different ear. I realize the social impact faster than other people. So very often they come to me, whether they are my students or not, and there was a very challenging class, a class with a very challenging group of boys who was shouting, screaming, throwing chairs, and when the girls wanted to talk and take up space, they would just shout them down. And one day, two girls wanted to fight in a corner of the room where they had mattresses, and they wanted to have a play fight. And then the boys said, "You are not allowed to have a play fight here, this is for the boys." And the girl said, "I have a green belt in Taekwondo, I want to fight." And then the boys, and the girls were 5th grade, the boys were 6th grade in the same class. And then they started provoking the girls and said, "Yeah, but you're going to start crying anyway." And the girls were, "No, we're not." And then without any warning, one of the boys hit one of the girls, and she fell down. And then she started kicking and screaming, and so end of this all, we had recently developed a concept of pedagogical consequence, and the consequence of hitting somebody is going home for the rest of the day and then work on the restorative practice later. And when we sent him home, he was screaming and shouting and was so angry, but it worked well because we were like sitting calmly. He came back to us, talked to us, and then he went out. The next week in the democratic classroom, he said he wanted to talk about Lina because Lina privileges girls. And a colleague of mine came to me and invited me to the class and said, Lina, would you mind coming to the class and explaining this to the boys? And then I told my colleague, who's also a male, about male privilege. And I said, there's a 12-year-old boy who just hit an 11-year-old girl, and I'm the one who has to come to the class to defend myself. And this is an example that shows the asymmetry of power relations very well, and also shows the sense of entitlement that we insert in boys, and that we have to counteract actively. And we have to set the boundaries, otherwise we will never reach a more equal society.
In how far are there risks associated with putting relationships at the center of educational practices?
We were discussing the question of child protection, and we also have I think we have very similar opinions on that, but they also slightly differ. Because the Odenwaldschule, Helene Lange Schule, and other reform pedagogical institutions in Germany, their people really crossed the boundaries of kids, and that was sexual abuse. And so there needs to be a professional understanding of what the role of the teacher is that is very clear, and the boundary is also clear. But that doesn't mean in turn that nobody ever touches a child, or a child is not allowed to touch a teacher. So I think the boundary is very clear, no sexual behavior between teachers and students. But this can sometimes be taken too far. So under the umbrella of child protection, people stop caring and tending the kid's basic needs, like a crying kid that wants to be hugged. Also, the question of consent is very important. You can ask the kid. And that is all tied to this relation of like the kid is not responsible for the well-being of the teacher. It's the other way around.
The German word Beziehungsarbeit means the work we have to do to create and maintain a relationship. In how far is this work, the Beziehungsarbeit, an actual part of the job of an educator?
I think we've answered that more or less. Just one more thought, because we discussed that also. Just imagine you as a teacher, you enter a classroom, you teach your lesson, and then you leave the classroom again. I mean, in most contexts, unless you have really like robotic young people sitting there who are very used to this kind of teaching and this kind of interacting with an adult, it certainly simply will not work. This is not how learning processes, how interaction works. So I mean, yeah, just imagine you would do it like this. It's just not working, especially when you work in places where you first have to establish a relationship to get into, let's say, teaching or learning English or French or whatever. So this is certainly not working.
I think you also had very important points about this earlier, that's again related to also neoliberalism and time restraints. So relationships are increasingly becoming a part of the job description of teachers, but the job description of teachers is ever growing, and the load of lessons is not increasing accordingly. So that is, I think, a big challenge with regard to Beziehungsarbeit, or the work you have to put into a relationship. And again, I'm repeating myself, again, that's the responsibility of the teacher, because Beziehungsarbeit in that sense is part of the paid labor of the teacher, while the kid will probably relate to you, it's not the kid's job to make the relationship a good one.
Yeah, I find that such an interesting word because I can't think of a word in English that mirrors it. And what I really like about it is that it acknowledges that relationships are hard work, you know, that we really need to put the effort into them. So I suppose I just love the idea that we could share this word with a non-German speaking audience, because it allows the teacher to acknowledge then that, okay, this is part of my role and this is something that I need to plan for in as much as I plan for curricular content.
And we've talked about this also in terms of democratic classroom culture. So because of the asymmetries of relationships, we need ritualized places where we can reduce or minimize the impact of power relationships that we don't want in these situations. So there's the class council, Klassenrat in German, or like the student council, and they are at different levels options to do the work that is needed to maintain the relationships, and this in a like participative way. There's also like Familienrat, family council, and all these concepts help you to. A friend of mine once said, sometimes it helps to build structures that are stronger than your character. And I really love this because especially in the very, very challenging everyday life of teachers, it's not only about the character, it's also about the strength. And if you have the rituals to fall back on, everybody knows, okay, here is a time and space where my voice is heard. Here's a time and space where the power relationships shift. If only a little bit, they change.
What other relationships beyond the direct student-teacher relationship are important in educational contexts?
I think this goes back to the point we've made about the relational system of the classroom, and actually that system extends beyond the walls of the school. So the relationship that the teacher has with the student is also influenced by the peer relationships, you know, how children engage with each other, children's relationships with their parents and their communities, the relationships of the parents and communities to the teacher. All of these are in dynamic interaction and are really important to keep in mind. So, for example, we know from studies of social referencing that children will look to adults in their lives to find out how they're supposed to feel or act in a situation when they're unsure. So, for example, if a child sees that a parent and a teacher get on well together, have mutual respect for each other, this will filter down then to the relationship that the teacher and the child have with each other. I mean, the evidence around the involvement of parents in education is so strong at this point in terms of academic outcomes, social outcomes, emotional, psychological outcomes. It's one of the most well-established elements of social psychology. So we need to keep these other relationships in mind too.
So, like when we are talking about these other relationships, we also talked a lot about the relationship between a student and themselves. So the attitudes they have towards themselves, and then as a next step, the relationship they have with their primary caregivers in the first formative years and how this influences their attachment styles. And then this broadens to other relationships. So the role of the teacher is to acknowledge the importance of all the different relationships, whether harmful or not. They are important for the child, they are a resource. So the job of the teacher in that sense is to strengthen and not to weaken the relationships that the kid has as points of reference. Whether you agree with the values of a family, a community, a sports club, or a religious group, it doesn't matter. And we had the idea, we also talked with some people of the teacher habitus group that as a teacher, your actions also shouldn't limit the options of positive identification, because identification is a resource also. Can even be described as a form of capital in Bourdieu's sense. So instead of limiting them, you should always act in order to amplify them. So instead of saying, like, your performance of masculinity is harmful, it might sense to point out that friendship is a value and that you can also find positive identification in friendships.
So one point very short, because we discussed it. So the goal of establishing relationships is not to get somebody closer to myself, but to encourage and empower people with the power I have to give the opportunity to let people, to let students be on their own. This is the goal of establishing a relationship. So.
Yeah, in attachment terms, they talk about the secure base from which to explore the world, and both are equally important. So an attachment lens on teaching positions the teacher as the secure base for the child to explore their learning and explore their world. So if we hold on too tightly, in the secure base actually becomes damaging in some way, you know, and equally if we let them too loose with no base to come back to. So it's that balance.
Or like in like terms of education, the definition of education as a process that aims at its own abolition. So I as a teacher can't form a relationship with a student that the student will depend on for the rest of their lives. That's not my role, that's parents. I as a teacher form a relationship with the student that helps them become more and more independent and then decide for themselves with whom they will form whatever relationships they want.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.